Let's get some analysis now with Alexey Muraviev, who's an Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin University. He joins us now from the Australian city of Perth. Welcome back to the program, Alexey. Marco Rubio on Sunday said Ukraine and Europe would be part of any, quote, real negotiations to end Moscow's war. Is that enough to allay Kiev's and Europe's concerns about being left out of the process?
Clearly, it's not, if you're thinking from the European or the Ukrainian perspective. Having said that, I certainly heard the Russians making this very straight and blatant point, simply saying, well, why the Europeans are actually complaining about not being part of negotiations. Nothing has stopped them from initiating those talks before Trump came into the White House and picked up the phone to dial Vladimir Putin. So I think what we need to understand is when it comes to this conversation that is taking place in Al Riyadh and will probably continue through a variety of channels, Ukraine will not be the center point. The Russians and the Americans have such a massive agenda to discuss, and many of the things will be intertwined. And that requires a bilateral approach. It requires non-involvement of the third party. So I think the Europeans and the Americans the Ukrainians will be brought in specifically when the conversation about Ukraine and anything that may be related to the resolution of that conflict will be negotiated between the Russians and the Americans. So it's just the state of affairs understanding who has the bigger leverage in the room. And unfortunately for the Europeans and the Ukrainians, they don't carry a lot of leverage right now. It's the might of the Washington versus the Russians.
Do you think the US talks with Russia this week are more about gauging how serious Vladimir Putin is about ending the war rather than kickstarting peace negotiations?
Look, I think both delegations have been mandated to start preparing a top-level meeting between President Trump and President Putin, and I think this conversation is part of that conversation. So clearly, both leaders indicated, well, Trump more than Putin, that they want to have face-to-face conversation, maybe not as early as late this month, as Trump indicated in one of his interviews, but certainly in the very near future. And for that, there should be a mapping road. There should be some sort of agreement. And normally, before heads of state meet, respective parties that engage in negotiations prior to the meeting of heads of state have to agree at least on 90 to 90% of the issues. So the two heads of state come together, work out minor details. They don't start negotiations from scratch. And I think that would be the mission of those delegations, because regardless of the conversation between the Ukraine matter, the Russians and the Americans have too much to discuss. There is too much of a debris, and there is a lot of things they need to clear simply because of their status as global powers, as nuclear superpowers, as countries that have too many fingers in too many pies.
And Alexey, Volodymyr Zelensky told the recent Munich Security Conference that the time had come for a European army to be created. And we recently had the UK say that it would be prepared to deploy peacekeeping troops to Ukraine if necessary. Do you think there is an appetite from European leaders to bring about a peace in Ukraine using its own resources?
Well, there may be an appetite, but we need to differentiate between what the politicians are saying, who are not going to go to the front line and actually stop the conflict, and the reality on the ground, including assessment of the fighting potential, of the defense potential of the Europeans, the Ukrainians, and the Russians. The reality is that the Europeans have been talking about the European army for decades. It didn't go anywhere because Europe without the United States, just like NATO with the United States, is a completely different configuration. Europe doesn't have the resources nor the political will to assemble a force substantial enough to run strategic affairs or balancing act against a major power, a major military power like Russia on its own. It requires the United States security involvement for the foreseeable future. The manufacturing, the production capacity of European defense industry is inadequate to what the Russians managed to mobilize over the past 3 years. The Europeans cannot put a sufficient force on the ground to effectively meet the Ukrainian requirements in terms of peace enforcement element. And Zelensky at various times were talking about a force between 100,000 to 200,000. The Europeans have to go effectively through initiation of conscription, creation of many combat formations in order to meet those tasks. And I don't think the pacifism in Europe that exists would allow them to mobilize masses to be drafted into the military or change the approach to social welfare policies or economic policies in order to start investing more in defense. And even if they will do it, let's imagine for a moment this is all happening, it would still take many years before Europe would reach that stage. And we're talking about the standoff between Russia and Europe right now. So there may be a lot of brave talk, especially now since Europe has been stunned by deliberations made by US delegations, including the speech by J.D. Vance over the weekend. But when it comes to practical implementations, I think the story would be very different from the declarations.
Okay, Alexey Muraviev, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks as always for joining us on the program.